My name is Wendy Potter and I'm a program manager here in the Victim Services and Crime Prevention Division. I'm also a member of the Provincial Third-Party Reporting Work Team. I wanted to take this time to acknowledge that we are in the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We are honored and grateful to be living and working here. Before we get started, please ensure that you have muted your computer and your phone. Also, if you have any technical difficulties with the online meeting and are unable to rejoin the online meeting, please follow along on the conference call line with the PowerPoint. The conference call line, again for your reference, is 1-877-353-9184, and the participant ID is 4477604#. We have many members of the provincial work team here today, including myself. As I said, my name is Wendy Potter, and I've been involved with third-party reporting for many years, with my first job being at Waiver Rape Crisis Centre in Vancouver. I'm looking forward to the webinar today, as well as hearing from many of you today. Now, we're just going to do a brief round of introductions of the presenters.
Good morning. My name is Tracy Portier. I'm with the Ending Violence Association BC.
I'm trying, but
I won't disclose my age, but I've been there for 24 years.
Thanks, Tracy. And my name's Morgan Baldwin. I'm also with EVA BC with the Community Coordination for Women's Safety Program and have been with CCWS since we started in 2000. And my background is as a community-based victim services worker in Prince George and as well as some time in Terrace at Kasan Society. And I'll pass it over to Steph to introduce herself.
Hey everybody, Sergeant Stephanie Ashton, Crime Prevention Services, BCRCMP. I'm one of the provincial violence and relationships coordinators, and I also act as the coordinator for third-party reporting of sexual assault for the province. Over to Alison.
Hi there, I'm Sergeant Alison Lauren. I'm with the Vancouver Police Department Sex Crimes Unit. We're actively involved in third-party reporting, stemming back almost 20 years with some agencies in our city. Happy to be here.
Great, thanks everybody. And this is Morgan again here. I just wanted to introduce the rest of the third-party reporting work team members who aren't able to join us today for the webinar. So many of you will know that the BC third-party reporting protocol is guided and supported by the provincial third-party reporting work team. And we'll talk a little bit more about that further in the webinar this morning. But I also wanted to introduce other members of our team. So we have from CCWS, our acting legal analyst, Christy Uris, is on the work team, as well as some other folks from our CMP BC division. So John Brewer and Alana Dunlop. And we also have the BC Association of Municipal Chiefs of Police represented on the work team through Deputy Chief Shane Barber. And the BC Association of Chiefs of Police is also a member of the work team through a formal liaison through the BC Association of Municipal Chiefs of Police member. So thanks again to the work team for working so hard on this protocol to develop it, and also for this webinar today. And so to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing, we're going to be talking in bulk today about the BC third-party reporting protocol, and starting out by setting out some context about sexual assault coordination, particularly the British Columbia context. Talking about third-party reporting, giving an overview and talking about what the benefits are of that protocol. We'll spend some time talking about how the protocol developed and what the provincial structure looks like, and some information about the third-party reporting process, as well as the importance of relationships at the local level and local interagency protocols. And so I did want to mention a few people who've really been involved who aren't part of the work team anymore, but really shaped the development of the protocol as well, which Tracy's going to be talking a little bit more about how that developed. But Gisela Rupsat and Michelle Nowakowski from EVA BC really were pivotal in the development, as were Mike Chadwick and Scott Green on the municipal policing side. So just wanted to thank them as well. And so to let you know that this webinar for today is now becoming part of the third-party reporting training package that's provided by Community Coordination for Women's Safety and Crime Prevention Services with the RCMP. And so this webinar today will be step one of the training package, which also includes a one-day skill building training that many of you on the webinar have been part of before, and many of you have not. But that's really the intention for third third-party reporting is for this informational webinar to be the first step in the training, followed by the one-day skill-building training on third-party reporting that Community Coordination for Women's Safety provides with our partners, Crime Prevention Services, with the BCRCMP. And then, of course, we do provide follow-up and ongoing support from CCWS and from Crime Prevention Services. So that's the plan for today. So we will finish the content at 11 o'clock this morning, and then we'll take a break for 15 minutes, and we'll have a question and answer period from 11:15 to 12 o'clock. So just to set some context for where the third-party reporting protocol came from and who we are as an organization, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our program and about the Ending Violence Association of BC. And so this webinar is coordinated by Community Coordination for Women's Safety that leads the third-party reporting work team and the BC third-party reporting protocol. So for folks who don't know, EVA BC is a provincial nonprofit umbrella organization that coordinates and supports the work of over 240 community-based anti-violence programs and initiatives across BC. We provide training and education to community-based anti-violence workers and frontline responders across multiple sectors, provide support and case consultation to our member programs, and conduct research and develop resources for survivors and frontline responders, and support and collaboration across sectors. So the Community Coordination for Women's Safety program, as the slide says, we're on slide 6 for folks who are following along on their own, is a program of the Ending Violence Association of BC. And so you can see our section on the website up there. If you go to endingviolence.org and click on prevention programs, you'll find Community Coordination for Women's Safety. And we are really based in and grounded in and grew out of the work of coordination initiatives across BC. And so those are, many of you are part of them. They're comprised of local community and system-based responders addressing domestic violence and sexual violence. We're going to talk more about these coordination initiatives in talking about the BC context of sexual assault coordination, but we do really want to acknowledge that it is those cross-sector teams that envisioned and developed community coordination for women's safety originally in the late 90s, and really guide our work as we work on third-party reporting and other initiatives. So we did develop community coordination for women's safety out of that lengthy history of work in BC, as well as some models of working across sectors in Ontario and the United States to coordinate local as well as provincial or statewide responses to domestic violence and sexual violence. We're funded by the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General, and really we were started in 2001 with a 3-year pilot project with a number of funders. And we successfully secured program funding in 2004 from the provincial government, and the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General has provided funding to CCWS since that time, since 2001. So what we do, we have regional coordinators that are based across the province that work with communities that want to develop new coordination initiatives on domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as those communities that want to enhance the work that their coordination initiative is already doing. And so that generally looks like support over the phone or by email, as well as traveling to communities to do training sessions on various topics, and also to facilitate strategic planning by coordination initiatives. And so we're moving on to slide 10 for folks who are following along on your PowerPoint. Another really central aspect of the Community Coordination for Women's Safety program is the issues analysis. So where coordination issues that are getting in the way of safety at the local level and working collaboratively to change those. Sometimes there's things that can't be resolved at the local level but require a response at a provincial or other level, and that's really where our issues analysis piece of the program comes in, and in particular by the legal analyst. So looking at if it's something that can't be resolved at the local level, does it require a law or policy change, or is it a matter of communication out to the various sectors about existing legislation and policy or guidelines? And that really, I think, is what the coordination initiatives across the province identified all throughout the 1990s, is that each community shouldn't kind of be reinventing the wheel, and ideally there would be a connection both for those persistent issues that can't be resolved at the local level, but also to share best practices that are developed at the local level. And really that's where third-party reporting comes from. And then we have really a big part of our issues analysis is our provincial level working group. So very similar to a local coordination initiative, it has representatives working with various sectors that you can see on your screen on slide 11. So lots of folks working with Indigenous, immigrant and disability communities, community-based service providers, the criminal and civil bar, Justice Institute of BC, RCMP, E-Division, BC Association of Chiefs of Police, Legal Services Society, provincial government, and community corrections. And really that group exists for the same purpose as local level coordination initiatives, to look at what's getting in the way of safety related to the issues of domestic violence and sexual violence, and what can we do collaboratively to fix those issues. And so the third party reporting work team that guides this protocol is a subcommittee of the CCWS working group. So on to talk about the context of BC's sexual assault response coordination, and lots of really amazing work that's been done here. And so what we're seeing right now is very welcome and long overdue public attention and support for survivors of sexual assault. And we think it's really important to acknowledge that the steady efforts that have been made since the late 1960s to increase public awareness, safety, and support related to sexual assault by individual agencies and by folks in cross-sector partnerships between agencies. So some examples are specialized support and counseling programs, training for responders, coordinated responses to ensure access to health and legal options, prevention information and support in the schools, in the general public, in the media, and in awareness events and marches. And really, this has all been the result of survivors of sexual assault who spoke up about their experiences and what they needed, often in the face of judgment, shame, blame, and disbelief. So it's not new for survivors to be speaking out about sexual violence, but certainly seems to be a more supportive response that we're seeing more recently. So survivors encouraged and were involved in starting sexual assault centers and women's centers to support other survivors in the late 60s and early 70s in BC. Transition houses were also starting around the same time, providing safe spaces for families impacted by domestic violence, which very often includes sexual violence. In the 1970s and 80s, community-based and police-based victim services, counseling, outreach, and other advocacy programs, as well as system-based responders, joined in these efforts. So we really want to start by honoring survivors for their courage and determination, and we appreciate that it's survivors who conceptualized and encouraged working on the development of all responses to sexual assault, including the third-party reporting option.
Morning? Yesterday, probably after you left.
So we start this with a bit of a story that comes from the United States that many of you will be familiar with, and it's talking of this context that we're providing is talking about just how many people a survivor comes in contact with, both service providers as well as other support systems, and the positive difference all those who respond can make. So this is an excerpt from sexual assault survivor Emily Doe's victim impact statement, and you can find the full version of this available online. But for folks who don't remember, back in 2015, two Stanford University graduate students biking across campus spotted a freshman sexually assaulting a woman behind a dumpster, and they intervened as she appeared to be unconscious. They then chased down and held Brock Allen Turner, who was the assailant, until the police arrived. He was indicted on 5 charges, 2 for rape, 2 for felony sexual assault, and 1 for attempted rape. The 2 rape charges were later dropped by prosecutors, and in March of 2016, he was convicted of the 3 remaining charges of felony sexual assault. So these convictions carried a potential sentence of 14 years in prison, but in June of 2016, the Santa Clara County Superior Court Judge Aaron Persky sentenced Turner to 6 months in the Santa Clara County Jail, of which he served half, to be followed by 3 years of probation. And the judge said he feared a longer sentence would have a severe impact on Turner, a champion swimmer who once aspired to compete in the Olympics, a point which was brought up repeatedly during the trial. So in her victim impact statement, Emily Doe addressed Brock Allen Turner directly, detailing the severe impact his actions had on her, from the night she learned she had been assaulted while unconscious to the grueling trial during which Turner's attorneys argued that she had eagerly consented. So she spoke out about being disappointed with the gentle sentence and angry that Turner still denied sexually assaulting her, and talked about sharing her story publicly, although she didn't share her name. She goes by Emily Doe, to really light a fire. And so we think it's really significant that that was the context, and yet here is this, what she says in her victim impact statement about all the people who helped her. So she says, to conclude, I want to say thank you to everyone from the intern who made me oatmeal when I woke up at the hospital that morning, to the deputy who waited beside me, to the nurses who calmed me, to the detective who listened to me and never judged me, to my advocates who stood unwaveringly beside me, to my therapist who taught me to find courage and vulnerability, to my boss for being kind and understanding, to my incredible parents who teach me how to turn pain into strength, to my grandma who snuck chocolate into the courtroom throughout this to give to me, my friends who remind me how to be happy, to my boyfriend who is patient and loving, to my unconquerable sister who is the other half of my heart, to Alayla, my idol, who fought tirelessly and never doubted me. Thank you to everyone involved in the trial for their time and attention. Thank you to girls across the nation that wrote cards to my DA to give to me, so many strangers who cared for me. Most importantly, thank you to the two men who saved me, who I have yet to meet. I sleep with two bicycles that I drew taped above my bed to remind myself that there are heroes in this story, that we're looking out for one another. To have known all of these people, to have felt their protection and love, is something I will never forget. And so this really, I think, describes to us why it's so important that we have a really broad-based collaborative approach to support survivors of sexual assault and to hold assailants accountable. So just a couple of really positive pieces coming out of that story: that Emily Doe published her victim impact statement online with the goal of creating awareness and change. And within 3 months, it had already been viewed by 11 million people. Also, the Judge Persky was recalled in June 2018 by California's voters, the first recall in California's 86 years of having that legislation in place. And the case influenced the California legislature to toughen sexual assault laws by requiring prison terms for rapists whose victims were unconscious, and included some of the crimes that were committed specifically against Emily Doe. And so this is an American case, and so the laws are not so relevant to us here, but certainly the impact of survivors and the bravery of survivors in speaking out about sexual assault, as well as the importance of a broad-based coordinated response, are really underlined by this case. So a little bit more about context. We always think it's important to talk about statistics, and we don't really know, as the image, moving on to slide 14 now, talks about. The image there is that really what we see with statistics is the tip of the iceberg in comparison to what's actually going on with sexual violence or sexualized violence. So we do have a couple of sources of statistics that we rely on. So all criminal incidents reported to police that are then reported to Stats Canada are called the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey. So you'll see the acronym UCR throughout Stats. And then in addition to that survey, Stats Canada also collects information on survivors' experiences with crime through the General Social Survey on Victimization that's conducted every 5 years. So that collects data on criminal incidents, whether or not they have been brought to the attention of police. So those complementary services are the surveys are the main source of data on crime in Canada. So as this slide said, it's estimated that from that General Social Survey, the last one that was done in 2014, it's estimated that 633,000 Canadian adults aged 15 and over had experienced at least one sexual assault during the year prior to the 2014 General Social Survey, which corresponds to a rate of 22 incidents of sexual assault per 1,000 people aged 15 or more. So that was just in the 1 year prior to the General Social Survey in 2014. And moving on to the next slide, you can see that in a 5-year period from 2009 to 2014, there were an unacceptable number, but much lower, 117,238 sexual assaults reported by police to Stats Canada from 2009 to 2014. So really everything that we look at in terms of statistics in Canada points to a rate of around 5% of sexual assaults being reported to the police. And that's certainly what came out in the Statistics Canada General Social Survey in 2014, is that it's among the most underreported crimes in Canada, with only 5% of sexual assaults reported to police. And of course, of concern in general, as well as including with third-party reporting, is that for some groups, particularly those with fears and concerns about the justice system, the numbers are even lower, and those survivors are least likely to report. Of course, there are folks who are particularly marginalized who face additional risks and lower rates of reporting. So certainly Indigenous women self-reported in the General Social Survey a rate of 115 per 1,000 people, where non-Indigenous women self-reported a sexual assault rate of 35 per 1,000 people. So the rates of sexual violence that Indigenous women are experiencing are much higher than non-Indigenous women. We also know that sex workers are particularly vulnerable to sexual assault, as well as more physically violent sexual assaults, and more likely to involve multiple assailants. So this is a study from 2 decades ago that, with survey of sex workers in Vancouver's downtown east side, revealed that 62% had been sexually assaulted on the job during the previous 6 months. And so lots of folks who are particularly vulnerable, including sex workers. There's some research that shows that sex workers are more likely to experience sexual assault that involves physical violence requiring hospitalization. So lots of concerns and lots of need to increase access and increase supports for folks who are vulnerable. We do have some interesting statistics in Canada about around gender. So we know that people of all genders are survivors of sexual assault, and generally statistics show that the proportion of reports by gender identity is similar for self-reporting and for reporting to the police. So this is from a study, Police Reported Sexual Assaults in Canada from 2009 to 2014. 87% of survivors identified as female and 13% identified as male, which is the same proportion as the self-reported rates in the 2014 General Social Survey. So lots more that could be talked about there in terms of the complexities around gender, but really important for third-party reporting for folks to know that it is an option that's available for folks of all genders. So moving on to the slide 20, so the visual there talks about those stats again, the 87% of victims or survivors identifying as female and 13% identifying as male. It also, in the bottom 2 parts of the graphic, talks about who the accused is. So again, this is from the police reporting stats. So of those that were reported, when it is a female victim on the left, the accused person is a male in 99% of the cases. And with the police reported stats about male victims, the male is the accused in about 93% of the cases, or the assailant, and a female assailant in about 7% of the cases. We also do find, in talking to folks who work with male survivors, that they're at much higher risk as children. That's generally the time as children and youth that men are experiencing sexual violence. And also a lot of interesting statistics, quite sad, about how often for men they're being sexually assaulted by somebody in a position of authority, such as coaches. So another piece that's important when we're looking at statistics is what happens in the court system. And we're not going to spend a lot of time here. We're just trying to provide some context. But this is another a study that came out from Statistics Canada in 2017 about court outcomes of police reported sexual assaults in Canada. So of all sexual assaults reported to the police from 2009 to 2014, less than half resulted in a criminal charge. Around 1 in 5 went to court, and slightly over 1 in 10 led to a criminal conviction over that 6-year period. And so this is something that survivors often talk about when they do have the goal of the person who assaulted them going to jail, that these kind of statistics are part of what gets in the way of getting involved with the system at all, including making a report to police. And so we'll come back back and talk more about that when we're talking about third-party reporting, but really important that survivors understand all of the capacities and the protection that's available through the police, and that reporting to the police isn't solely for the purpose of gaining a conviction in criminal court. So just in summary, really what we know from statistics, and this certainly is what we have learned as frontline workers and in other positions with survivors, is that sexual assault is really under-recognized, including by survivors who may not know that what happened to them was a sexual assault. Really low disclosure rates, as we've been talking about, and lower disclosure rates being linked to discrimination based on race, class, disability, age, occupation, mental health, and other factors. And so a lot of work that we won't spend too much time on this, but just to say that one of the major issues that we have in British Columbia is the need for a cross-sector policy on sexual assault. And particularly around coordination, so what the various sectors should do and how they should work collaboratively together. I think that's, so we have some information here in the PowerPoint about some presentation that happened in the 90s about the importance of coordination and including a sexual assault policy. So this actually comes from Linda Light, who was a policy analyst working with Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General, talking about how really sexual assault doesn't fall neatly into the category of being a health issue or a counseling issue or a criminal justice issue or human rights issue, that it's all of these. And so no one system alone can provide an effective
There's
response.
one other issue that's arisen, but we're not anticipating being able to deal with it in this 3-week period. Yeah.
And so moving on to the next slide, really recommending that a consultative, coordinated, or collaborative response from the healthcare and counseling and criminal justice systems will have the best chance of meeting the needs of a survivor of sexual.
I would have assumed we would have done it next week, which is the first week. But again, we were wanting to canvass that with the
So
judge.
somebody who is joining the webinar by computer, we can hear your conversation, just a heads up.
I mean, I don't think defense counsels,
I can hear a conversation between two people.
but that was part of the reason why I thought it would be important to get it back in front of the court.
So I think it may be what's showing up on our line. Okay, it's being muted. Thank you very much. So moving on to the next slide, there were some consultations that were, as I was mentioning, that were done in the 1990s by the Ministry of Attorney General toward a sexual assault policy. And some of the highlights, we're not going to go into them in depth, but really what it starts talking about on slide 26 are what survivors of sexual assault recommended. And similar to other sectors that were consulted with, there was a lot of recommendation around coordination of case information, proactive referrals, and also recommendations around someone being present during a report to the police, but that person be trained so they know how to be a support person without interfering with the investigation and the outcomes for that survivor in that process. So lots of recommendations around coordination between hospital and justice system personnel as well. And slide 27 talks again about what some of the police participants recommended, which was again about ongoing communication, keeping the survivor informed, proactive referrals to victim services with specialized training. And corrections as well talked about improved coordination with forensic services and more liaison among police, Crown, corrections, and victim services. Consultations with victim services, women's and other community organizations recommended, again, proactive contact with community-based victim services with consent of the survivor, that the survivor automatically receive information on her case, and a really important learning that we continue to have, that sometimes in our enthusiasm to provide support, we can overwhelm people. So the organizations were recommending coordination in contacting the survivor to reduce the number of contacts. Consultations with Indigenous women, lots of really important learnings that came from that and that we hope will be carried through into the development of a sexual assault policy in BC, which there are some plans to move forward on by the provincial government. But back in the 90s, some concerns that were raised by Indigenous women were concerns about racism within the justice and health systems, fear of reprisals for survivors and service providers who report, especially those living in isolated communities, Indigenous women talked about the importance of individual healing, but also collective healing for everyone who's impacted by the sexual assault, which generally includes the entire community in one way or another. Indigenous women talked about the need for Indigenous support services led by and staffed by Indigenous people, and also some really important conversations about Indigenous justice measures being best used as an adjunct to rather than a substitute for the criminal justice system. And so something that we've been seeing a lot more attention toward in BC, especially for the last several years, is the importance of a trauma-informed approach. And we know that this really trauma-informed practices and the understanding of how to recognize and understand the impacts of trauma and the root causes of violence and abuse, so to avoid re-traumatizing people and supporting resilience and recovery. It's really been something that's been part of Indigenous communities' practice and teachings since time immemorial, and many Indigenous communities practice land-based healing to address the impacts of trauma historically and more recently with dealing with colonial violence. So lots of recent attention in BC to increase the capacity of community and system responders, and the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General developing the trauma-informed practice curriculum as a lead up to developing the provincial cross-sector sexual assault policy. It's a really important and necessary part of our context in addressing sexual assault, is having this understanding of a trauma-informed approach and what the impacts of trauma are on survivors. So some tips, of course, it's a very complex practice, but at the same time, there's some really important pieces that flow through our responses to sexual assault survivors, including third-party reporting. So making sure that we're slowing down the process and understanding that survivors are very tuned into verbal and nonverbal communication. So your tone means everything to a survivor. Creating opportunities for micro and macro decision making. So nothing happens without the survivor's consent, if at all possible. And in your practice, you're not leading, the survivor leads the process. And this is as much as possible what we've tried to embed in the third-party reporting process. We do have a EVA Notes that's being developed on a piece of the trauma response that's really important about understanding the physiological response to trauma and how common it is for survivors of sexual assault, well, for all trauma, but including survivors of sexual assault, to quote unquote freeze, and a more appropriate term, tonicomobility. So 70% of all survivors experience this because of the flooding of stress hormones, and the body becomes very still and rigid and silent. And this can be really helpful to know for survivors who are blaming themselves for acting in a certain way, and understanding that it's part of a natural trauma response. So a little bit more by way of context, as we mentioned earlier, our work with Community Coordination for Women's Safety is founded in and guided by local coordination initiatives across BC that are comprised of local, community, and system-based responders addressing domestic and sexual violence, criminal harassment, and child sexual abuse. And these coordination initiatives in BC really were sparked by the development of the Violence Against Women in Relationships policy. So first developed in the 1980s as the Wife Assault Policy, and later renamed to Violence Against Women in Relationships in the 1990s. That was intended to be followed by a sexual assault policy setting out the protocols, roles, and responsibilities of service providers across systems. And as I was saying, that began development in the 1990s, but the provincial sexual assault policy was not completed and is now under discussion again. But in essence, what happened is that there were a number of committees for coordination initiatives funded in the late 80s to pilot implementation of the Violence Against Women in Relationships policy. And that's really where we've seen those communities that were funded, meaning having core funding to do the work of coordination, and then other committees that developed around the province to implement that policy and to look at the barriers and the problems and fixing them collaboratively. Those teams that starting on slide 37, that sat on what are often called VOWER committees because of the naming of that policy. So lots of different sectors sitting at the table. What's happened across BC is that those committees have also been addressing issues of sexual violence, both in the context of violence against women in relationships or domestic violence, as well as one of the things that this visual is showing is that these committees often had sexual assault subcommittees that are sometimes focused on developing a sexual assault response team with the relevant responders, sometimes focused on doing education, as well as protocols for all who are involved with sexual assault response. So those committees have really done an amazing job of shepherding coordination along absent a provincial policy. And again, some of the lots of different types of work, really amazing work happening at the local level in terms of coordination around sexual assault, including third-party reporting. But some of the key elements that have been identified for those coordination initiatives are the need for specialized support services, the need for health options, the need for legal options, and the need for offender interventions. And what some of those teams have done in terms of the key elements of the work are response and referral protocols, public education and training for responders, but really always having that bigger picture vision of making systemic change, looking at what are the problems, what's getting in the way of safety and healing for survivors and accountability for people who are using violence, and making change there as a collaborative team. So now, just to talk briefly about third-party reporting, the third-party reporting protocol on slide 39, the visual that you have in your webinar shows really the overview of the BC third-party reporting protocol, which has two pillars. So the first pillar is support for sexual assault survivors, and the second pillar is the opportunity to provide information about a sexual assault to the police anonymously. And you can see in the visual that the community program is in that bridging role, supporting the survivor to connect with the police and supporting the police to connect with the survivor. And so what they are, in essence, in BC, the community programs facilitating third-party reports are community-based victim services that specialize in responding to sexual assault, domestic violence, criminal harassment, and child abuse. And we're going to give a little bit more detail later in the webinar about why these programs are a natural fit to facilitate third-party reports in BC. But third-party reporting are reports sent to the police by community-based victim services on behalf of an adult victim or survivor of sexual assault without the survivor's name and contact information. And third-party reporting is not in and of itself an investigation. It's solely a means of engaging and supporting survivors who face barriers to reporting to police and obtaining basic information about the crime. And so all of our documents, with the exception of the form and the cover sheet, which we'll talk more about shortly, are available on our website. So on slide 41, it shows you the third-party reporting section of the CCWS website. So the documents that we're talking about today are all there, as well as a description of third-party reporting. And so I'm going to pass it over to Sergeant Ashton now to talk about the BC police reporting options, which really are an important part of the context for third-party reporting.
Hi, everybody. Please call me Steph. I don't know who that person, Sergeant Ashton, is. So what I'd like to do is just kind of go through this slide with you, because I think it's informative for people that are not police officers, but also I've found upon occasion that some of our newer police officers aren't familiar with what the options are in relation to sexual assault. So obviously, going from what, as a police officer, I would consider to be the number one option, a full report to police, which includes the victim or survivor coming forward, providing statements, receiving support from our victim services and from community-based partners, and the matter being fully investigated, forwarded for potential charge approval, and then it moves forward in the system depending on where that goes. That's a full report where we expect that we would have, upon the completion of the investigation, the opportunity to put the matter before Crown Counsel. So that's option number one, is the one that I think both myself and Allison would tell you would be our favorite, because we both like to catch people that are committing these types of crimes. But we also know that with only 5% of people reporting to police, we're not even coming close to capturing the number of times that we aren't able to help. So we do have other options. the next option that we'll talk about is an information-only report. And there's a misconception out there by I think the public and police officers that if you engage in speaking with a police officer about sexualized violence, that you are required to proceed through a court process whether you want to or not. In fact, that's not the case. The only type of offense where we have pro-arrest or pro-charge is violence in relationships, where we're required under both our provincial VAWIR policy but also the policies of our police agencies to proceed with charges or proceed with request for charge approval on any matter where we have reasonable grounds to believe that an offense has occurred. For sexualized violence, it's not like that. Instead, somebody who has been victimized can come forward to police, provide a statement, obtain support, and have some decision-making and choice around what they do next. If they're not emotionally, physically, or mentally capable of moving forward to full charge or to having the matter put before the courts, then we can support them in whatever way they see fit. Obviously, keeping in mind that if there is a risk to the public or risk to the individual, that we're going to attempt to do everything we can to protect them, and that might involve working with them to get to where we have a full report that seeks conditions on the offender. So information-only reports can be a great way to liaise with your police partner. For the community members out there, that you can support your person in coming in, talking with the police, coming up with a plan, which might include a safety plan, and potentially, when they're ready and willing and able, moving into a full report. When that fails us, as we know, with only 5% of people reporting, that neither of those options are necessarily the most popular with the public, we were able to move to third-party reporting, where the victim or survivor can report anonymously through a community-based agency, community-based victim services partner. The key to this with third-party reporting, what I feel is most important, is first and foremost that person is supported by a community partner who can help them get the resources they need, medical attention, whatever they need. They're in the driver's seat as far as what happens next, but the police have access to information about potential offenders, potential patterns of behavior that are going on in our communities. And if there is a serious risk to the public or to that individual, we can, through our partner, bridge back to that victim and let them know that we are concerned about their safety. But primarily by taking these reports, we're letting that survivor know that they're believed. I don't even like to talk about the last option. I know it's on there, and that is a choice for some people. But to me, it's the option of no resort. I don't really like no report as an option, but if we're hearing about it because that person has engaged in services, great, no report's fine. My concern is that 95% of people aren't aware of their options, so this is really the focus moving forward, to get those options noted.
Sergeant Lauren here. I'm just going to speak a little bit to the benefits of third-party reporting that the VPD has seen and other agencies over the years we've been involved in it. The first is that the survivor is connected to specialized support. They have someone working with them who's familiar with the system and can answer their questions and take care of their emotional and physical needs when the police are not in contact with them. And the system allows information to be given to police anonymously, so we get the critical data and critical information that survivors have. We've got excellent analysts in place, and so once a subject of complaint or a suspect is brought to our attention, they're on police radar. What happens, we find, is that knowing who they are and that there's previous reports of their behavior can lend weight to subsequent reports from additional victims. And this can help police to prioritize our resources and our response when we're able to identify serial offenders more quickly, even when the initial victim has perhaps not come forward. So it really does help us in looking for trends or predators within our city and across the region more broadly. It's also helping to facilitate a consistent and effective response across police jurisdictions. So often I'll be receiving reports from UBC or the island for victims who were victimized in the city of Vancouver. And by having a consistent response, what we're seeing more and more now that we're standardizing our procedures is community groups are reaching out either to Eva or to Steph at the RCMP or myself to follow up on make sure that we've received reports, especially if they're being transferred across jurisdictions. So we've got greater police accountability for where these reports are going and which agency is ultimately responsible for them. And we're also finding that it truly acts as an incentive for interagency collaboration and partnerships with our community partners. When I receive a third-party report, I'm in email contact, generally with WAVA, which is the Women Against Violence Against Women agency in Vancouver. So I'm on a first-name basis of response with the people who are taking these reports. When they have questions, I feel that they're more comfortable in reaching out to me and know who I am and that they're going to get a timely response from me. And it provides the police with an opportunity to let the victim know what their options are and they can assess it on their own timetable. So often I'm emailing to WAVA and providing some recommendations of things that the victim can consider, such as saving communications or WhatsApp chats. I can advise them of perishable evidence that I would like to pursue but won't without their go-ahead, such as taxi driver witnesses who may have picked them up from a scene or securing the clothing from an assault. And also to advise them if they've had a scene kit done at hospital, it's only being stored there for a year and that they do have the option to come forward to police and we will store it forever. But just to let them know what some of the options are and then they can consider it on their own timetable and make a decision as to how they want to move forward.
Great, thanks, Allison and Steph. And I think we've really found with the third-party reporting protocol across the province, and now starting to see in other provinces and territories that piece around being quite a strong incentive for interagency collaboration and partnerships and awareness. So thanks for that. And so we're just going to take a step back now and talk about the history of third-party reporting in BC. And who better to lead us into that than Tracy Porteous, who was there for the history of the development. So over to Tracy to talk about that piece of it.
Thanks, Morgan. I neglected to say in my introduction that before I came to EVA for 13 years, I was at the Victoria Women's Sexual Assault Centre, as it was known at the time, working as an advocate and working with survivors of sexual assault. We had a process to collect and deliver third-party reports to the Victoria Police in those days, in the 1980s. And one of the things that I noticed anecdotally is that the most serious and violent sexual assaults were often perpetrated on the most vulnerable of women, and often, as Morgan said earlier, sex workers were probably the number one vulnerable group that I would identify. And at the same time, sex workers, because of the nature of their work, were often concerned about their sisters on the street or working indoors. And there was a interest amongst sex workers to get this information to the police, even though they didn't want to talk to the police themselves. And so we developed this process of third-party reporting that wasn't very sophisticated. It wasn't entered into a database. It was simply a paper file that the Sex Crimes Unit at the municipal department kept. And with any luck, you would have officers checking in with the paper file if they thought they had another serial offender in their midst. So there was three communities at the time in the 80s that were doing third-party reports in this sort of more of a manual way without access to a computer database. Prince George and the SOS Society and eFry Society was another one that we're working with the RCMP detachment there. And WAVA, Rape Crisis Center, was working with the Vancouver Police. I attended a meeting in the early 2000s. So now I'm like fast forward, I'm at the Anti-Violence Association of BC. I attended a meeting in the downtown east side where a number of advocates were gathering to talk about and debrief the shock of what happened with the discovery of Donald Baker, who was a prolific and serious predator that was violently preying upon sex workers in the downtown east side and women from Cambodia, as it turned out later. He got sort of discovered essentially by fluke. He was being investigated against violence against one woman, and they found in his trunk a garbage bag, or duffel bag, pardon me, full of videotapes of really violent sexual assaults he was perpetrating against sex workers. There were dozens of women, and not a single had reported to the Vancouver police. And so that got people to talking about what can we do to try to provide information to the police, even though women don't want to report for a number of reasons, as Morgan outlined a little earlier. And so we started talking about the possibility of doing more with third-party reporting throughout the entire province, because we also know that serial predators move around. They don't just stay in one community. In that conversation, we discovered that WAVA and VPD had taken the third-party reporting process and made it much more sophisticated, and were entering the information from third-party reports into a database so that they could track it. And so, long story short, that also tied into what was happening around the same time with Picton and the Highway of Tears. And so the police were very motivated to try to do anything that they could to increase their access to intel about the behavior and whereabouts and actions of serial predators. And we and advocates across the province were extremely interested in doing what we could to create a pathway for survivors to come forward to get help. So essentially, third-party reporting, from my own perspective, is about those two things equally. Increased intel for police to track predators, and access to support for survivors. And so we went to the municipal chiefs of police to explore their interest, and certainly they were extremely interested. So we did a number of things. I'm going to flip to slide 51. After doing some consultation with communities across the province by conference call and at one of our annual training forums, we started to get a pretty good picture of what we thought could be workable throughout the entire province, both talking to advocates and talking to the BC Chiefs Municipal Police and RCMP E-Division. So between 2006 and 2008, we developed a province-wide protocol, TPR cover sheet, and a form. In 2008, the BC Association of Police, Chiefs of Police, approved that protocol, and EVA then started developing a series of information bulletins, whether you are different kinds of frontline workers, to know what your role was in relation to third-party reporting. And so we also sat down and worked shoulder to shoulder. This is something I'm immensely proud of the RCMP, that we were working with them to develop policy that became RCMP policy on third-party reports. And the municipal police chiefs were right behind us. And the police protocol guidelines were, I would have to say, while we were kind of leading the administrative function of gathering a committee together, we were really leaning on Vancouver Police because they had already developed a whole series of business rules and tested them and tried them and brought them to the table for the other police partners to know that this was going to work. And so that was developed in 2008 and updated again in 2014. And so, as has been said, it's community-based victim assistance workers who have been trained in taking third-party reports that are the ones that take them. And partly the reason that is that they have a policy mandate to be the responders of sexual assault. Their files are owned by them. They are not required to hand over files to the police in a way that police-based victim assistance programs are. And for those community-based workers that have been around for a long time, they have access to a lot of training in the area of sexual assault. So the mandate, the training, the fact that they own their files, and they've always, since the day that they began, had a specialized focus on responding with the practical supports to whatever survivors need in relation to sexual assault. And they have relationships with the police, and they know how the justice system works. And so we're going to get into a little bit more about the intricacies of the protocol and how it works. So I'm going to turn it back to Morgan.
Thanks, Tracy, for that, as well as for all of the work that was summarized very briefly there. I think it's quite an amazing piece of collaborative work between police and community responders, and thanks to folks on the phone who might have been involved on that as well. I know that WAVA and Victoria Sexual Assault Centre and the Prince George Sexual Assault Centre were very pivotal in those early years of thinking through what would work best for sexual assault survivors. And so, as Tracy was saying, we're moving to slide 55 now. So the third-party reporting protocol was implemented, and then we did a survey within about a year and learned from that some of the changes that needed to be made. Particularly, there was a need for more community development support, both on the community and the policing side. And we've been providing that support since 2008 to the present through the Community Coordination for Women's Safety Program of EVA BC. So in 2013, we did a review of the protocol implementation to see how effectively it had been implemented, and had some really interesting learnings from that. So we did that review in a lot of different ways, including a survey and teleconference with folks doing third-party reporting across the province, as well as a workshop at our annual training forum. And some of the themes that emerged from that review are the need for more widespread implementation and awareness of the third-party reporting option, so across the province of BC. Also, a real need for clarity about what circumstances personal identifying information collected by community-based victim services will be shared with police, including community-based victim services legal authority to disclose client personal information without consent when there are compelling circumstances affecting health and safety. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into third-party reporting, but a really important piece that emerged, as well as the reinforcement of the community-based victim service agency's potential bridging role, which is namely to help vulnerable survivors overcome barriers to accessing the criminal justice system, and to be in that bridging role to enhance communication between the survivor and the police, even if the survivor isn't wanting to speak to the police directly. Through this time period, there was also the report of the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry that happened in BC that considered the police investigations into women reported missing from the Downtown East Side under the Public Inquiry Act, but it also looked at the connections around the province. And so the report doesn't speak specifically to third-party reporting, but two recommendations in particular that are on slide 57 highlight the goals that are consistent with the BC third-party reporting protocol, both the support for vulnerable and intimidated witnesses, as well as the building and maintaining of relationships between police and vulnerable members of the community. So a really important piece of our context as well. Following that review, we updated the police protocol guidelines and received renewed approval from the BC Association of Chiefs of Police. And if we haven't said, that organization incorporates both RCMP and municipal police in BC, which is a really important part of the protocol. In 2015, we also created the Community-Based Victim Services Protocol Guidelines and published the first edition of the third-party reporting guidebook, which pulls a lot of the information that Tracy had mentioned earlier together into one guidebook. We also received a number of grants from the Civil Forfeiture Office to address our wait list, lots of interest in trainings, and so that has been happening 2016 to 2018. And a little bit of information about expanding on what Tracy was saying about the community-based victim services programs being the primary programs that facilitate third-party reports on the community side. So as of June of last year, of 2 years ago, the third-party reporting work team was really taking a closer look at the fact that there's currently 66 community-based victim services programs in BC, and we really want to continue to push for more community-based victim services funding in BC to address, particularly in rural and isolated communities, those gaps. But the third-party reporting work team also agreed to expand the types of programs that can facilitate third-party reports by starting on a pilot basis to see in communities without community-based victim services programs whether it would be a good fit for the mandate and capacity of Stopping the Violence counseling and outreach and multicultural outreach programs in those communities. We also are working with a number of Indigenous support services, and that's an intentionally broad term, knowing that in some communities it may be a particular support service through the Band Council. It may be a Aboriginal Friendship Center that might be a good fit for in terms of mandate and capacity, and so as well as looking at other key services that are particularly well situated to connect with folks who are vulnerable. And so that is underway, that pilot, and what we'll be reviewing with those pilot communities is the challenges and benefits of implementing third-party reporting, as well as whether it's a good fit for their identified community program mandate and capacity. And so another really important piece of our development has been the enhancement of the third-party reporting protocol in 2017. So we implemented additional provincial processes and responsibilities for third-party reporting, including an enhanced response by BC's RCMP and Municipal Police Services, coordinated by BC RCMP Crime Prevention Services. And one of several initiatives we're leading to increase the availability of this important reporting option across the province. And so a review in the fall by the third-party reporting work team concluded that the 2017 enhancements will continue as a permanent part of the third-party reporting program, and Crime Prevention Services has committed to continuing coordination of police response for third-party reporting in BC. So I'm going to pass it over to Steph to give more of an overview of the new provincial police responsibilities.
So we'll talk about this right now, but what you'll be getting in the next few weeks is both a process map for how TPR will work, and that'll be available to both police and community partners, but also we'll be including in the police protocol the steps to take in order to enter a third-party report into crime. That's the Police Records Information Management Environment. For those of you that don't like my acronyms, please feel free to ask about them if I use any. So essentially, I have to actually thank Allison a lot for this, because she's really been supportive of us reaching a place where we feel that we're consistent in our response across both our RCMP and municipal police forces. So since we started this enhanced protocol in 2017, a lot of what we've been doing is looking internally at our systems and how we look at these files. And one of the things, to be frank, we found was we were having trouble locating third-party reports within our system because they were being inconsistently entered into our police records management system, which meant we couldn't really tell you how many reports there were. We had an idea, we couldn't confirm it. So what we've done now is created a process between which we feel will work for both municipal and RCMP detachments. We just found out this week, thanks to Allison's hard work, that we have a roll code, a secondary roll code that will be added to all third-party reports. And one of our biggest concerns, which I think would also be one that the community would have, is that in our response, we're not disclosing information about our survivors unnecessarily, where we're trying to ensure that our police systems also protect survivor identity so they're not at risk from potential offenders. But what this also will allow us to do is to carefully track every report we get. And also, we'll know when those files switch to full reports, because right now we know what happens. We've seen it in the files we've been following and tracking since the enhanced protocol in 2017, but we don't actually know how many times somebody started a third-party report and ended up going to a full report. So this is all information that's important to us. So what I'll simply say at this point is you will see some new documentation coming up, which is the result of our review, and eventually there'll be a report out from the provincial work team that'll document all of the information we found since we started the protocol. But what I will say is this: there's a commitment from both myself and I think we have Allison for about another 3 to 4 years.
Hopefully, yeah.
In her role, so we should be able to really get a very strong and consistent response that we can move on to sharing more freely with the public. Did I miss anything, Morgan? Are you familiar with this part of things as far as Shane's role in this, Allison? Or?
No, not
Okay.
particularly.
So I'll talk about it because Morgan was going to talk, but I think she needs a break to catch her breath. So your next slide shows you the commitment from Deputy Chief Shane Barber with the West Van Police Service as the current sitting BC Association of Municipal Chiefs of Police representative on the third-party reporting work team. What I would say is that I'm not going to sit here and read his words here. He reiterated these words to me when I visited his office a few weeks ago to meet with his sexual violence team. And what I was really impressed with was his commitment to come and sit in the room for 3 hours, even though he's up to date on practice around third-party reporting. So having BC Association of Chiefs of Police and the Association of Municipal Chiefs of Police has been incredibly important to ensuring that we're doing this well. And as we roll out this new practice, process map, and protocol for police, we will be presenting it to the BC Association of Chiefs of Police and Municipal Chiefs of Police for their approval. And then it'll go out publicly, likely by the end of February.
Great, thanks, Steph. And so just a little bit of information now about when not to use third-party reporting, because of course there are times when it's not appropriate. So it's really critically important that anyone taking a third-party report, so community-based victim services programs or the other pilot types of programs that we mentioned, that anyone taking those reports is aware of the situations in which third-party reporting is appropriate and situations where it's not appropriate. So first and foremost, it's not a substitute for a professional emergency response like 911. And a really key test to consider whether a third-party report is appropriate is whether anyone's at imminent risk of serious harm. The reason why a third-party report is not appropriate in this case is that most service providers have an ethical obligation to alert a relevant authority where they know that someone or a group of people is at risk of serious harm, and the promise of anonymity and confidentiality can't be upheld in such a case. And so really important parameters there. It's not appropriate. Third-party reporting is not an option if domestic violence or violence in relationships is present in current or in a past relationship with the assailant. So the reasoning behind this, as many of you will know, is that sexual assault or forced sex in the context of domestic violence is one of the top 19 risk factors for domestic violence, serious bodily harm, and homicide. So a report by a survivor that they're in an abusive relationship that includes forced sex would meet the criteria of imminent risk of serious harm and not be appropriate for third-party reporting. For a third-party report, it's worth noting that the risk factor of forced sex in the context of domestic violence is reported with some frequency, but for numerous reasons it's believed to be heavily underreported and likely more underreported than any other factor. And so there's research continuing in that area, but some of the research says that forced sexual acts are known to be underreported both by survivors as well as by perpetrators. And a second related reason for the exception around domestic violence or violence in relationships is that in BC, they have a pro-charge policy when it comes to domestic violence, and therefore if they saw domestic violence or violence in relationships as a factor in the third-party report, they would have an obligation to take steps to learn the identity of the survivor and accused and pursue an investigation according to their policy. Another situation where a third-party report would not be appropriate is when a child is in need of protection, as defined by the Child, Family and Community Services Act in BC. As you all very likely know, there's a requirement to make a report to MCFD when this situation is present, and therefore, again, the confidentiality, anonymity could not be maintained. If the suspect is a police officer is another exception, and this is because police have a requirement under the Police Act to notify the Independent Investigations Office of any incident that might fall within the jurisdiction of the IIO. And long story short, most sexual assaults would fall under the IIO's mandate of investigating any police-related incidents of death or serious harm. So another area that we're working on now is the whole area of survivors under 19. So it's still the case that in all but rare and exceptional circumstances, third-party reporting would not be appropriate for survivors under the age of 19. But we're just going to talk a little bit more about what that might look like in really exceptional circumstances. So the one-day training really goes into a lot more depth on this, and so this isn't a training on working with survivors under the age of 19, but really it's something that could be considered in exceptional cases for certain young survivors under the age of 19. So we released an information bulletin on the issue of third-party reporting for survivors who are under 19 that's available on that website section we referred to earlier. And what it outlines is that there are a number of factors that need to be taken into account in exercising that discretion. So first, the community-based victim services and police must satisfy themselves that there are no child protection concerns involved, which would require a report to MCFD or the delegated Aboriginal agency, and listing circumstances in which a child would need protection, such as when a child is being or is likely to be sexually abused or exploited by the child's parent or another person, and if the child's parent is unwilling or unable to protect the child. So some child protection concerns, of course, would have to be explored first. And in addition to that, the community-based victim services and police would need to determine whether the child or youth, so anyone under the age of 19, is a mature minor, which is a legal definition with a number of pieces to explore in terms of the youth's ability and capability to make their own decisions about the privacy of information they provide without the parents or guardians having to be notified, and also explores whether the youth understands the risks and benefits of engaging in the third-party reporting process. Also really important to make an assessment as to the physical and mental well-being of the child, and determining whether or not any other children would be endangered by not proceeding with a full investigation. So for example, is the child a student, is the suspect a teacher, another student, whether they have access to other children in the same age range. And so really what the third-party reporting work team has concluded, although we're putting out some materials to support these exceptional and rare circumstances, is that they're very complex variables that couldn't be addressed through the generic third-party reporting protocol, which applies to adult survivors. And so we continue to recommend a really cautious case-by-case approach. And what we do recommend is that the local agreements are developed similar to the protocol for adults that we're going to talk about shortly, that a protocol is developed, and not necessarily to work with youth who are under the age of 19 around third-party reporting and sexual assault, but how to assess that case-by-case exceptional circumstance of a youth doing a third-party report for a sexual assault. And of course, as with everything with third-party reporting, we can provide support with that through Community Coordination for Women's Safety. And so really the basics, and as I said, the one-day training goes much more in depth into privacy principles and practices for community-based programs, but this is really important in terms of basic privacy practices, and this is nothing new for community-based victim services and other anti-violence agencies. Really important that the client is informed up front about the limits to confidentiality at the time that they request service, and the fact before they take the third-party report, which is covered off on the cover sheet. And so the client should be aware that their anonymity can't be assured in situations of imminent risk of serious harm to them or an other individual or group, or where a child's in need of protection. And really getting the clients, the survivors, informed consent to what those exceptions might be. But barring those situations, the community-based victim services workers have an overarching duty to protect the privacy of the client who is making a third-party report. So once the cover sheet with the victim's information has been completed, it should be stored in accordance with their agency's policy in such a way that the client's contact information can only be accessed by using a confidential file number. So really important to be, as community-based victim services and other anti-violence programs do so well, to be balancing the need for clients to be informed about what the limits to confidentiality are at the time they request service, and at the same time doing everything we can to protect the privacy of personal information about clients, in this case survivors of sexual assault. And so now we're going to go and talk a little bit more in depth about the BC process for third-party reporting. And again, the full one-day training goes much more in depth for folks who are actually going to be engaged in supporting survivors to complete the reports, as well as for people on the policing side. But this just gives you an overview of what's happening for the community-based victim services programs, as well as for the police. And so if you're following along on the teleconference, we're on slide 67 now. And what this is talking about is the role of the community program as a bridge in facilitating third-party reports. So this information is available in much more detail in the guidebook, in the police protocol guidelines and the community-based victim services protocol guidelines that are in the appendices A and B. But essentially, the survivor can refer themselves to the community program, or they can be referred in through other agencies. And what the community-based victim services program does is to explore and discuss all the support options that are available to that survivor, to explore all the reporting options to police, as Steph has covered earlier, to address any barriers to making a police report if that's possible. And then if the survivor does choose to make a third-party report, explaining the third-party reporting process to the survivor, including the limits to confidentiality, reading the cover sheet out loud to the survivor and completing that with the survivor with their contact information, and then supporting the survivor to complete the form, the third-party reporting form. So it's not an interview, it's the community-based victim services worker explaining the process and the form and the purpose of the questions ahead of time, and then providing the space and other necessary supports for the survivor to fill out the form themselves, and then assisting the survivor once they're done with filling out that form with any emotional impacts and support needs, as well as managing the cover sheet and the form. So supporting the survivor to complete the form before and after, and then bridging communication between the police and the survivor. So again, the role of the community-based victim services program is a bridge for communication. It may be to pass information from police, such as the police file number, or to request further information, or request for the survivor to meet with the police and make a full report. It may also be the survivor passing on more information to the police or requesting to meet to make a full report. So there's a lot of information, again, in the guidebook and in the training about how that works in particular, but really important to know that the cover sheet stays with the community agency with the survivor's personal identifying information on it, and the form is given to the police, to the local police. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about some differences when it's for police from another jurisdiction. But what you have in your guidebook in Appendix D and Appendix E for third-party reporting are samples of the cover sheet and form, and they're out of date. Their third-party reporting work team continues to update the cover sheet and form, and also the originals can only be obtained from Community Coordination for Women's Safety. That enables us to ensure communities have the most up-to-date version of the form and cover sheet, and also provides the necessary community development support that's required for facilitating third-party reports, such as having a local agreement in place about how this will be managed by community-based victim services and the police. So the most current form, and again, we're just in the final stages of updating this for 2019, but the most current versions, as at slide 68, are the January 2016 version of the cover sheet, which has information for the survivor about third-party reporting, as well as the limits of confidentiality, and includes the survivor's contact information, and then the third-party reporting form from December of 2017 that has the agency information, the survivor information, except for their personal identifying information about the offense, about the assailant, and about the assailant's vehicle, if there was a vehicle involved. And so that in terms of the forms themselves, one of the reasons it's so important that this be done and facilitated by a trained community-based victim services program worker or other anti-violence workers is to help the survivor understand the intention of the form and what to expect in terms of next steps. But really, one of the changes that we made to the form itself, besides having that anti-violence anti-violence worker there in the room to explain the purpose of the form, we also put some things into the form to explain to the survivor what the purpose is of asking these questions. So often survivors experience any kind of interaction as judgment and blame, and very often it is. And so we wanted to be really clear that when we're asking for information on this form, it's to assist the police in tracking and analyzing the behavior of the assailant, including how they responded to the survivor's words and actions, and really wanted to underline that the questions are not intended of a judgment of how the survivor acted to or behaved to survive the assault. And as I said, the further review of our form in 2018, including by some of you who are part of the webinar, led to some changes to the form, which we're currently finalizing. And so with the form and the cover sheet, what we do when we make any changes is we send them out to the community-based victim services programs around the province, as well as to those pilot community programs that are working to assess whether third-party reporting is an appropriate fit. So you should be seeing something coming out about that soon. And so again, as I said, the worker keeps the cover sheet with the identifying information of the survivor and assigns an agency file number, and then keeps a photocopy of the form. The worker then sends the original form to the nearest police agency without the survivor's identifying information. And important that the form is either hand-delivered or sent to the appropriate police agency via registered mail to ensure continuity of evidence. And so then once the police respond to the Community-Based Victim Services Program to let them know they've received the third-party reporting form and what the police file number is, then the Community-Based Victim Services worker shreds the photocopy of the third-party reporting form. And again, we have much more information and support available for Community-Based Victim Services programs, including in the training, but more in depth around records management and how those documents are managed. So as Steph was describing earlier, the 2017 enhancement to the protocol saw still the same process where the form goes to local police, but we then added an email alert to Community Coordination for Women's Safety as well as Crime Prevention Services to let us know that third-party report form has been either dropped off or sent by registered mail to the local police. And then the third-party reporting work team also added a piece to that process, which is to ask that if the community program hasn't heard back confirmation from the local police within 2 weeks, to email a follow-up to the local police and to CC us, Community Coordination for Women's Safety, on that follow-up as an accountability measure. And so what we do then when we get that email alert is we reach out from CCWS to the Community-Based Victim Services or other identified community program, and Crime Prevention Services reaches out to the local police agency. So the intention is really to enhance, as Steph was saying earlier, the support for those of you who are working with third-party reports on the front line, and also for us to be able to track more comprehensively what's happening with third-party reporting in BC and to assist in troubleshooting when needed. So we're now looking at slide 73. And do you want me to keep talking?
Do you want me to talk about it?
Sure.
So, hi, it's Steph again. Morgan needs to have a chance to have a drink of water. There's a lot going on here. So what I thought I'd do is we'll step into what happens once the report has been received by the police. And for my police partners out there that are listening to this saying, I had no idea this even existed, it actually is in our sexual assault policy for the RCMP, and it's also written into the sexual assault policies for our municipal partners, which I know because the Association of Municipal Chiefs of Police actually made sure that happened in their individual agencies. So it does exist. I'm here to support the process once you receive those files if you're not familiar with it. But essentially what happens is we're talking about where they're from different areas, or
yeah.
Okay. So basically you've heard what happens when you transfer it from one police or from the one community-based agency to the police of jurisdiction in that agency area. And like I said, I'm here to support police officers in what happens at that point. You will have a detailed process map to help you coming up in the next couple weeks. But when we have one, for example, we had a recent one in northern BC, and while the communities were quite close together where the incidents occurred and where the survivor was seeking services, they weren't connected through their police agencies. So what we've moved to now, the coordination position is full-time, is that if you receive a third-party report from a victim that is from outside of the jurisdiction of your police agency, those will be sent by registered mail to me or to Crime Prevention Services, where myself and a group of us who work on these will then ensure that they get forwarded to the appropriate police agency, and in many cases the appropriate police designate within those agencies who will conduct the review of the file and subsequently open a police file, provide a police file number back to the original jurisdictions. So the bridging still occurs in the same way, in that the community-based agency works with the survivor. The only difference here is that we're facilitating the appropriate person reaching out to that community-based victim services agency to make sure that we're connecting the right people. And then this way we know that the survivor is being given the best opportunity to deal with the appropriate agencies at the time. It also allows the police of that jurisdiction to assess imminent risk from their point of view, which the local police agency would not necessarily be able to do.
Great, thanks, Steph. And I think that's really with the third-party reporting protocol. We can hear a little puppy joining the webinar.
Yeah, someone's dog is joining us.
I think it really is one of the many ways that the third-party reporting protocol attends to the fact that sex predators can travel across jurisdictions, and often do, and also allows the survivor to make the third-party report in the community that she's living in, even if the sexual assault happened in another police jurisdiction. So really appreciating our police partners for smoothing that process out for us. And so some tips from community-based victim services that we've heard. So the most important tip is to ensure the survivor is empowered, that it's their decision, their choice, and their words, really importantly. Maintaining the relationship with police by working as a bridge between them and the survivor, and knowing that the police may want to speak to the survivor and giving the survivor the choice, so not acting in a gatekeeping role, but always taking the request back to the survivor, knowing that it does remain their choice, but something may have changed for them since they made the third-party report, and even hearing back from the police that they're interested in speaking with them further is something that often makes the change for survivors in terms of their willingness to come forward and speak to the police directly. And so another tip from community-based victim services, to be as informed on third-party reporting as you can be, as you may be presented with questions from others. And we're going to get back to talking more about the importance of that broad-based community response and the referrals from key agencies that are involved with survivors to the community-based victim services programs to explore all their reporting options. And so we're going to move on to the information about what the police do with the third-party report form. So over to Steph.
I mentioned a little bit there that this is built into our policy. What you're going to see now is we will be providing our police partners with almost a poster-sized version of what you need to do in order to make the third-party report work. I highly recommend as we move forward in this, though, if you're in a community where you have been acting as a community-based victim services agency and you've already been trained in third-party report, you're moving forward, but you haven't liaised with your police partner in some time, I highly recommend that you check back in with them. And if you're getting some pushback, then that's the point where you can reach out through CCWS to me, and I can help support my police partners in being the most up-to-date in how they do this response, because sometimes it's simply that they're not aware of it because we have turnover within the RCMP world, as most of you know. So essentially what the police partner is going to do is receive the third-party report form from the community-based partner, either by hand or through registered mail, review that form and provide a police file number. So at this point, we're not talking about investigative viability. We're simply saying that you're going to create a police file number within our PRIME system to ensure that we have some accountability for where that form is going. You'll scan that form to your police file in PRIME so that it's attached and can be viewed by any other police agencies, so that if there are consistencies in the reports between jurisdictions, we're tracking them in two ways. One would be through our own checks on PRIME of individuals who are identified. The other way is through our BICLASS, or victim crime linkage system, which I'll talk about in a sec. So essentially the next step, once you've created your police file and entered the appropriate information that you feel you need in order to adequately discuss it in your synopsis, you will decide whether you have investigational viability. And what I can tell you is, at the very least, you're going to reach out to your community-based partner and request that the survivor come forward and provide more information when they're ready to do so, and let them know that you're interested in speaking to them further. It doesn't matter where you're at with investigational viability, it is as to whether you can move forward. That's really more related to imminent risk. What we're really saying is, we believe you, we believe something happened to you. Here is your police file number to show that we want to make sure we can track this for you at a later date should you choose to do so. The next part you see in the slide here on the right side is maintain confidentiality. And you may be saying to yourself, what does that really mean? Well, here's the thing. In our smaller communities, we know that sometimes when the police receive these third-party reports, either because of the offender being identified or some key information in the report, they can tell who the person is that's made the report. The whole idea behind third-party reporting is that we respect and maintain the confidentiality of that survivor, that we don't, push forward and investigate because, oh, I know that so-and-so from down the road because of what the description of the tattoo is or something of that nature. So we ask that police officers respect the request for confidentiality at all costs. It's very important to the credibility of this program and something that we ask you to agree to in your protocol agreements with your community partners. Otherwise, we can't continue to have the trust that we've been building in this program since 2008. At this point, once you've got everything in front of you, you're conducting your usual preliminary review for any investigation where you're seeing where you're going to go. You're going to enter your data into your system, into Prime, and you're also going to consider VICLAS. And when I say consider VICLAS, or the Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System, Morgan's really happy right now because I said it right. What we're really saying is, if you are looking at something in that third-party report that makes you concerned that there may be further action or this may be predatory behavior, then we ask that you proceed to VICLAS. What our national VICLAS policy has said is that in practice, they don't take anonymous reports. However, our VICLAS team in British Columbia is committed to reviewing our third-party reports using that crime code I was explaining earlier. So essentially, they're going to keep them in a separate category and regularly review them. But they also say that if you get one where you're saying, I don't like this behavior, I think it's something that we need to look into, you absolutely can send it to VICLAS and they will accept it. So that is the standard line right now. A national VICLAS has agreed to allow that to move forward. And I have to say that it's the commitment of our local analysts and the police investigators at VICLAS that has led to this outcome. They were not comfortable with saying that when we see one we think is bad, we'll forward it on. They want to be able to see them themselves because they're looking for some very specific stuff. What are they looking for? Well, we know that in 98% of the third-party reports we've received since we started tracking this, the offender is identified to some capacity. And what I think I'd like to do is maybe let Alison have a moment to share what she considers to be the types of things that we can put on the police file, even when we know the name of the individual. Do you know what I mean? Like I've read some of your reports on what it looks like. Do you want me just to continue?
Yeah,
give you a moment? Okay. I'm sort of throwing this at Alison out of nowhere to keep her included. Because in Alison's, you have to understand something. Alison's a frontline practicing sergeant in a sex crimes unit. So often she provides a really good, up-to-date perspective on what's going on. Whereas I'm sort of doing that provincial thing where I'm hearing from all of you on the front line about what sort of trends we're seeing provincially. So we're really fortunate to have this sort of combined high level of expertise in threat assessment and current practice, along with my sort of ability to bring the big picture to the work team. So all I'm going to say about this is we're talking about deviance here. So I talk about this for our community partners because you may not understand when we're talking imminent risk or potential for or viability for investigation what that really means. When we look at these reports, we're looking for things like, did the offender say or do something that's consistent, that's kind of unusual? And it can be everything from, say he sprays perfume on the survivor prior to engaging in the sex act. That is something that can be tracked in VICLAS. That is something that we can look at as a consistent pattern of behavior of the offender. And that's a pretty minor one. It can also be fetishes. It can be, those of you that have been in sex work for a long time, you know that these guys are out there and you know that they're engaging in these behaviors. When you hear that type of behavior in these reports, your spidey senses should be tingling, both for the community-based partner and for the police partner, that there's something more going on here and we need to dig deeper. And that may mean that we come back and say that this is a community safety risk because we know we have more files to look at. Or the offender's name crops up, and I can tell you that there have been, I think, 2 cases that have led to one that went over to our DVAC, Vancouver Domestic Violence and Criminal Harassment Unit, because another person had been victimized, was identified as an actual partner of this individual. And in another case, someone who we had 3 or 4 reports over several years involving someone that we believed to be the same individual. That file went back, was opened and reviewed as a potential for predatory behavior. So we are seeing these files lead to full investigations because of the intelligence gathering that we do. Anything you want to add to that, or are we good?
No, I would agree. We're seeing the same names pop up or the same location. For instance, a restaurant with servers being sexually harassed by a boss. We'll see that repeatedly, that kind of file. So.
Yeah, so it is working. Next slide, my favorite slide in the bunch. This just gives you an overview. For those of you who are looking at this saying, what the heck is this? You're not a police officer. It's okay. This is actually Prime. This is the computer system that we use. We added this slide in because, as you can see, we've started to use that C third-party report tick box that allows us to have some tracking. That was sort of our stopgap until we came up with this new code. And what I'll just point out now is if you're looking at the screen and you can see primary offense codes, that's where we'll see our primary offense will still be sexual assault. Our secondary offense will be this 8000 code, which will be third-party report, not for disclosure. The exact language on what it's going to look like is not finalized yet, but essentially we are all about protecting the identity of the people reporting to us in these cases, because since we don't know who the victim is, if the offender was ever to gain access to this information, we have no way to protect them. So we're taking several steps in the process at this point to ensure that the identity of our survivors is protected from vulnerable sector checks. We have been assured that these don't show up, and we're now working with our access to information and privacy people and disclosure people to give them that sentence that says this is not for disclosure because it could potentially affect the safety of the victim. That's all we need to do. For the members out there that are saying, I have concerns about what you're asking of me. We tried to get a roll code change on the offender to call them other. We were not able to do that, but we will be calling them subject of complaint. The true definition of subject of complaint is someone who has had that a report to police has been made on, does not make them a suspect, does not make them someone we're charging. We also have new uniform crime codes that were designed to address the unfoundeds, which now sort of limit the ability of the police to write something off as unfounded. And just so you guys are all aware, BC had the lowest rate of unfoundeds in the country with the highest rate of reporting on the RCMP side. So our numbers were significantly lower than the rest of the country. And that is in fact related to how our Prime systems work. Everywhere else they use a different police reporting system. So this was just a little screen we thought we'd throw in there to make sure that we had the police feel comfortable with what they were doing.
And I think you covered that.
I won't go into the VI-class again. We've kind of explained what our priorities are now with VI-class, and that they're supporting us heavily, and that when we get unusual information, which I think some of you are probably nodding your head out there saying, yeah, I know what you mean by unusual. I've seen that before. Those are the ones in particular where we're going to be going back to our police officers and making sure that they're doing our VI-class database checks.
Great, thanks, Steph. And so we're looking at slide 78 now, and this is just to update you on where we are with all of these changes that the third-party reporting work team has been making. So we're in the final stages of updating the form and the cover sheet. Steph's mentioned the new tools that are coming out to direct police action regarding third-party reporting. The work team is just developing an update about all of this to send out to both the community-based victim services and police partners who are working on this at the local level, as well as others who are interested in making referrals in or learning more about what's happening with third-party reporting. The third-party reporting protocol guidelines, both for the police and for community-based victim services, will be updated. And the police protocol guidelines, as Steph was mentioning before, will go to the BCACP, the BC Association of Chiefs of Police, for renewed approval. And following all of that will be publishing the second edition of the third-party reporting guidebook to really bring all of these many exciting changes into the core document that guides third-party reporting in BC. So that's where we are now in terms of the work of the provincial third-party reporting work team. And just to talk quickly about some of the results, and then we'll move into talking about the local interagency protocols, and then take a break and have some time after that for questions and discussion. So the results, again, to summarize, are the support for the survivor, the community agency storing the names and contact information for the survivor, the central databases for the police that Steph has described, getting the information on there, and that preliminary review that Steph described that the police do. So really important results, as well as Steph was describing, so much more capacity now with having the provincial level coordination on the police side to be taking an in-depth look at the numbers and the outcomes around third-party reporting in BC. So some of what's on the next slide, starting on slide 80, are some outcomes from the earlier days of third-party reporting, but really this is consistently what we hear in terms of outcomes from third-party reporting, is that they're quite diverse. So the first example was Eric, and none of these are the real names of the survivors, but Eric is a sex worker who was sexually assaulted by a quote-unquote John. He goes to the BC Society for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse and completes a third-party report. And the information on the form provided a first name for the assailant and a partial license plate. So no investigation was pursued, but the information was placed in Prime as intelligence. And then moving on to the next slide, you'll see that 2 years later, another male sex worker reported to 911, so made a full report of a similar occurrence and another partial plate. So there was enough information to gain a complete plate number, and the suspect was identified. And so the police were then able to go back to the BC Society for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse and request contact with Eric to investigate further. And he did, in fact, come forward to make a full report in that situation. And so that's one of the outcomes that can happen. And I think that Alison was referencing that earlier as well, with seeing these linkages between these the survivors of these prolific offenders, and that third-party reports are one of the ways that that information can emerge if it's tracked by the police on their systems. Another outcome that's on slide 82, it talks about a pseudonym Lisa for the survivor, went to a restaurant, and this was kind of in the early days of online dating, and met up with a man. The next morning she woke up with limited memory of the night before, but believed she'd been drugged and sexually assaulted. She went to WAVA and completed a third-party report that identified the suspect. The police wanted to investigate further, but Lisa did not want to have her name revealed, nor did she want to have a further investigation pursued, and so it was used for intelligence, so flagging the subject for information in the event that further complaints arise. And so that's another outcome that we think is really important, where the choice ultimately does rest with the survivor about whether they come forward unless there's a situation of imminent risk of serious harm. So another example that's on slide 83 talks about a survivor who we'll call Dana, who was sexually assaulted 20 years ago, and this is a family friend. So she didn't want to cause a rift in the family and hadn't reported it until she was an adult, which she did by completing a third-party report with a community agency. And in that situation, the police did get back to the community agency and say that they were interested in speaking with her further, and she did agree to provide further information, pursue an official complaint. She made a full report to the police, and the subject was charged and a trial proceeded. So a few different outcomes there that, and we know that's consistently what we still hear today, that there's definitely a need for that bridging process, so the survivor can stay with their wishes to only have a third-party report, or if something changes for them, they can build a bridge to the police to make a information-only report or a full report. And then we have a quote on slide 84 from Denise Russell with Community-Based Victim Services in Prince Rupert, which we think really describes the whole comprehensive community approach that needs to be in place. And so Denise talks about having a connection with this particular survivor years ago on a different issue and having a trusting relationship with that person at that time. And then also paralleling that during conversations with other and networking with other service providers, bringing up the topic of third-party reporting and describing what they entailed. And so when this same person was sexually assaulted, she was seeing a Stopping the Violence counselor who encouraged her to look at the reporting options, including third-party reporting, and so referred over to community-based victim services to do that. And as Denise says here, it took a few months, but the client finally chose to do a third-party report, supported her through the process, and when she was done, she relayed that it wasn't as hard as she thought it would be and decided to proceed to make a full statement to the RCMP. So you can see a lot of, really excellent work going on in there by a lot of different people, and this is another outcome that we do hear about that we wouldn't have any way of capturing on data because it never proceeded as a third-party report. It proceeded as a full report, but we do know that, especially from community-based victim services programs, that engaging in the process, sometimes that's what happens for survivors. They have a lot of fears of what it's going to be like for them if they actually write down the details of what happened. And as in this situation, sometimes survivors they discover in the process that they are able to do that. And at other times, it's really that back and forth, hearing back through the community-based agency from the police that there's a police file number and they're interested in talking to them further. That can be a bit of a bridge building process as well, and trust building. So lots of very diverse outcomes with third-party reporting, and we think, again, one of the main pillars that's so important here is that for the survivors to be connected to specialized support services for emotional and practical supports and referrals to other supports and healing programs. So just a little bit more about the third-party reporting protocols and the importance of local development and implementation on those. And so, again, there's a lot of information on our website about this, and we can provide support by phone and email, as well as often this is part of our training programs around the local development and implementation of third-party reporting protocols. And so some of the preconditions that need to be in place before starting on this process, so the community agency needs to have a privacy and records management policy in place that would allow them to protect the privacy of that survivor's personal identifying information, as well as laying out guidelines about how to proceed should the police wish to connect with the survivor. There needs to be, as Tracy was mentioning earlier, the relationship between the protocol partners is really essential, so it's not kind of a protocol where the police and community-based agency can proceed without knowing each other and having agreements on how they're going to work together on third-party reporting, as well as other collaborative efforts. And then developing that agreement about the process, a written agreement. So what we recommend is a local interagency third-party reporting protocol. That's important so everyone is clear on what the steps are in the process and who's responsible, but also helps when there's turnover on the community agency or the police agency side, so the next person along can step into that process and see what the agreements are that have been put into writing. And so if you look at slide 87, this is actually a summary of a much more comprehensive document that's on our website about the steps in developing a third-party reporting protocol. So determining that draft agreement on the process and the protocol, we recommend that you test the process and the protocol. So actually walking through on the community agency side and on the police side whether the process that you've designed together is going to work in practice, and then finalizing that agreement as a local interagency third-party reporting protocol, and making sure that there's knowledge about that within the respective agencies as well. And then tracking and communicating about the third-party reporting option is really important between the protocol partners, so making sure you're keeping in touch with each other about how things are going and ideas you have for increasing the effectiveness and reach of all of the reporting options, including third-party reporting. And then we also recommend that there's education to make sure that folks in the community, sexual assault survivors, and the general public are aware of all the reporting options, including third-party reporting, as well as other agencies in your community that might make a referral to community-based victim services or other identified community agencies to make a third-party report. And I will say that one of the resources that we've developed as the third-party reporting work team is a pamphlet that local community-based victim services and other community programs can adapt to get the word out in the community, and just wanted to say thanks to the folks in Cranbrook for giving us permission to use their original pamphlet that they designed. It's really helpful, and I think you can adapt any part of it freely, or you can just simply insert your local agency name and contact information into that pamphlet. And another really important piece in terms of the steps, of course, is the ongoing facilitation of the protocol. So facilitating the filling out of the report, the form, and processing the data. And then the follow-up piece, really, I think one of the unique things about the third-party reporting protocol in BC, unlike other places where there are anonymous reporting options, is that partnership that provides the capacity for follow-up from the police to the survivor through the community-based program. Community-based victim services program and other identified programs. So that's what we recommend in terms of the local protocol implementation. And you do in your guidebook have kind of a template for a local interagency protocol. And then we have another number of communities that have agreed that we can share their completed protocols upon request to other communities that are interested. So certainly get in touch with us for support around that, as well as anything to do with third-party reporting. And so again, just to remind you of the section on our website, the third-party reporting section on our website that has information about third-party reporting, as well as the documents that support the protocol. And as we've been discussing, we have some exciting updates coming up soon. So we'll be sending them out to community partners and police partners, but also making sure that information is uploaded onto this section of our Community Coordination for Women's Safety website. So anything else from other members of the work team before we take a break?
Good.
No? Okay, so thank you, everybody.